I was very excited to get to talk about rye allelopathy. It is one of my favorite topics, having spent years of my young life studying it. But I've also come to realize that in general, I like to use my family as a focus group, that the level of enthusiasm of them and me is somewhat disconnected. So I'm going to balance this out a little bit today. I'm going to start with talking about rye allelopathy, and then we're going to talk more about cover crop breeding in general and the cover crop breeding consortium that I'm a part of, because I really want to pitch the new ideas that we're working on, and hey, I'm trying to build up support for some new cultivars coming down the line. As an agronomist, first and foremost, let's start with what we know from what we see in the field. That's where we always have to start. Rye as a cover crop used as a mulch is incredibly effective for weed control. That's the base observation, and that is not an observation that comes just from myself. As a representative of the Southeast, if you look at the extension bulletins on rye as a cover crop across the Southeast, all the states are now recommending it as a tool to deal with our Roundup resistant weeds that we have down there. So I'm in good company when I say this works well. So as an academic, however, we often ask the question, why on earth does it work well? Now, academics will just answer questions whether there's any practical outcome or not, but there is a reason we want to know that, and that's from a breeding perspective. If allelopathy is an important player in this, then that's something that we can improve upon. Something else we know about the system is we have a really tight agreement on how much of this rye cover crop it takes to control weeds. So independently, multiple states have come to around 8,000 to 9,000 pounds of dry matter is the cutoff. Once you pass that, a rye cover crop alone can be a sole weed control source. Now, I don't know many growers who want to do that, except for some organic folks. But once we get past that barrier, we practically have no weed competition, at least from the annual broadleaves and the annual grasses, which is primarily what we're combating in terms of resistance. So is allelopathy a significant proportion of that? Well, that's an excellent question, and it's a darned hard one to answer. I'll go back to an ancient slide here from my advisor in graduate school. But one of the best studies on this was one she conducted, where she took a host of cover crops and washed them for 24 hours in water, and then put out pot trials with the cover crop washed, with it unwashed, and a bare control. Well, the physical structure, a lot of the other things that weed control comes from a cover crop mulch, would be the same. The physical structure, the amount of shading, the impact on the temperature, or some of the things we'll talk about here in a second would have been the same. Only the allelopathy would remain. And rye comes out as a leader when that kind of work is done, is that rye tends to stick out as being the most weed control once you've washed, looked at that washed, unwashed difference. So what is it that is in, and I was loving the handout that y'all have today from one of my colleagues here. So what is it in rye that can make it special? For one, I worked with, this is a slide I produced as part of my PhD. I went back and searched for it because this is a slide I haven't shown in a long time, and it was still actually a slide because I had forgotten that was in those days we didn't have the old PowerPoint thing. So anyway, it may not look beautiful because I had to transfer it. But the amount of active herbicidal chemistry in rye is really amazing. Diboa is a compound that's mentioned in that handout, and that's something that in the lab, my colleagues that helped me compile this information, I mean, they wear a lot of protective gear when they're handling this. It's a very toxic substance. And if you look at the amount of it on a per acre basis in some rye varieties out there, you're looking at 3 to 4 pounds of active ingredient per acre. So think about that. I mean, that's like old school herbicide levels. That's atrazine levels of active chemistry that can potentially be out there. So we have a lot of reason to think that there is serious potential in rye. But now I do want to emphasize again, go back to that slide. We know that it works. Sometimes you say, well, then just use it if it works. But there are other factors that are in there. So here's a study. I did a series of studies. We have a lot of organic soybean production in our state. And so I did a series of studies for them looking at what they could do. This is before the whole region had appreciated how much rye and soybeans in particular could do for weed control. And so I had a rye study out there and was getting amazing weed control, but I had also tried out something else. I tried corn gluten meal as a pre-emergent herbicide out there for the organic growers. And that's where I had pigweed escapes. They actually grew better when they had the corn gluten meal on them than when they didn't. So also part of the rye suppression effect is actually nitrogen. This is particularly true when you have a soybean system. When you grow rye and a big cover crop of rye in the spring, when we plant in the spring, our parts per million of nitrogen can be under 5 parts per million. And then, why is that? Because the rye has taken every bit of nitrogen down through the soil profile and has put it up top. And then as all of that carbon decomposes on the surface of the soil, it actually ties up even more nitrogen. The microbes are attacking it, and they are actually using more nitrogen out of the soil solution to break down that surface residue. So we can maintain under 5 parts per million of nitrogen in the soil. Why does that matter? Well, that ain't enough to grow a weed. That's why it matters. That is not enough nitrogen to grow weeds. And so when you do have escapes through a rye mulch, they tend to starve to death. And so we have seen that. We've actually tracked the amount of nitrogen in pigweed as well. And so it can be a huge limiting factor just to starve them to death of nitrogen. Now, obviously, if you have a corn crop, if you have a cotton crop, this effect is not as strong for you because you're going to go out there and fertilize your crop. And you fertilize your crop, you're also fertilizing your weeds. But certainly for a legume where, soybeans actually, when we watch the soybeans in this system, the soybeans will look peaked too. That first month, they'll look like they're struggling in this much rye residue. And that's because soybeans don't have nodules supplying them nitrogen until about 4 weeks. But as soon as that nodule turns on, then they go gangbusters and just leave the pigweed behind. Okay, so if we think about some of the other factors, back up here, it's a cover crop mulch for weed control is going to provide shade. That can be an advantage or a disadvantage on your weed control. It's affecting the temperature very strongly. It's a huge physical obstruction. This is underappreciated, but the physical obstruction of the mulch to a weed is massive relative to our crops. Our crops are large seeded. They have a lot of power to power through an amazing amount of residue. I haven't seen too much residue yet for soybeans. They can come through anything that we've thrown at them. Cotton, you can get marginal there quickly. But for soybeans, there's never been too much in my experience. But weeds cannot handle a lot of residue just from the physicality of trying to grow up and wind their way up through it. They don't have the reserves. Weed seeds are tiny. There's also been an excellent series of studies about interaction with herbicides. So at first blush, a cover crop residue sounds like it's going to be a problem because it's going to tie up our herbicides. And there is some tie up of herbicides on the mulch. But also our weeds, because they are stressed by a mulch, are more easily susceptible to herbicides. So in fact, we find generally we have better herbicide effectiveness on a number of herbicides when we have a cover crop residue and not less. So the first set of studies with this came out of Beltsville about 25 years ago, and that's being followed up right now by Dr. Stephen Mirsky at the Beltsville lab. Again, now that is herbicide specific. So the amount of tie-up that we're having is herbicide specific. So anyway, if you're interested in that, I'd be glad to point you more specifics on that. And then again, nitrogen deprivation that we've already talked about. Okay, I would like to come back to that slide again. Let's focus back on it works. We know that we've seen it. We know how much residue it takes to do it. But going forward, is there anything we can do to maximize this from a breeding perspective? Because this is about seed here this weekend. So let's go forward on that. We could skip that one. This is again organic. I've done a number of these trials for organic now since it's worked so effectively. So our cereal rye breeding program is the newest of the cover crop breeding programs that we have. Again, as Risa mentioned, I did spend my PhD on this 20 years ago. But as also has happened with the cover crop, the amount of enthusiasm over cover crop breeding is just now there to actually support public sector breeding programs. So when I did it in my graduate school, it was because it was my passion. We didn't have particular funding to do that. Our wheat breeder got excited about it. I did it. I put together what I considered a more allelopathic population to start the breeding process. And then I took another job, and it spent 20 years in the freezer. But now the national conversation, there's a lot of folks interested in cover crop breeding, and I'm going to switch to talking about that cover crop breeding consortium and the species that we're hitting there. But there's now enough of funding available that seed got to come back out of the freezer, and so now we are screening for allelopathy. We have, across 3 states this year, we have 12,000 space-planted rye individuals out of that breeding population, and we're looking for a more allelopathic line to put on the market. So next year, I should be able to tell you whether at least we were able to find something. And what does it look like to find something that's more allelopathic? And I like to emphasize this all the time to all the states that we're doing the selection with. Let's, the next one, please. It better look like a bomb went off or I don't care, right? Again, the rye cover cropping system is working. for this to add value on the cover crop market, it needs to look really good. And so do we have examples of it looking really good out there? Is anybody bred for this anywhere else? And rice is our one good example. The rice allelopathic lines that have been released out of Southeast Asia look like a bomb went off. And that's what we want out of the rye, or otherwise, just let it be. We'll just continue maximizing rye biomass and doing the other things that rye can do from a weed control point of view. But if you ever, well, that came out a bit grainy, but that is on the left here, what rye looks like with barnyard gas competing with it. And here on the right, we see the rye with a massive amount of open space and soil showing, and yet the weed's not germinating and coming through in that. And that's what we want to see. And that's what our field bioassay, we actually plant pigweed seeds, 100 pigweed seeds under every individual rye plant, and look for the ones that look like a bomb went off. It doesn't get more simple than that, really. Now that said, we aren't going to place all of our eggs in one basket on any species. The other thing I want to talk here about today is just what does cover crop breeding look like? First and foremost, it looks like looking for regional adaptation in these species. Majority of the species that we're marketing across the country have received almost no breeding. They've certainly not received breeding for each of the major areas in which we are trying to sell seed in. So, you know, our consortium, we have a node in North Carolina, we have another node in Maryland, one in Cornell, and then we have advanced line testing in 13 locations scattered around the country. And so we're trying to breed for specific environments, but then we're also using advanced line trialing to look at where that might, you know, even if we develop something for North Carolina, it may, who knows how far that extends. We do not have that level of information at all in cover crops. I think what we saw the other day from the plant breeding materials centers will help us do that. And also our advanced line trials, we're hoping are going to help to establish that. So I posed you these questions here as I go forward, and Reese, you have to give me a time when I'm getting close here. But is plant breeding needed for cover crops? Or asked another way, does cultivar really matter? It sure doesn't seem like it if you look at the majority of the seed suppliers out there, just the local seed dealers we're looking at. When I go to my local seed suppliers, variety unstated is the best variety I can get most of the time in most of the species. And I really enjoyed hearing from our vineyard manager the other day that they don't consider that sufficient, and I don't consider that sufficient. And when I've actually, so several times when I've noted that we always put variety unstated from the local dealer in as a check. And so when I do that check, I've watched that check just wildly vary from year to year. And so one year for the rye, I came back and I said, wow, that variety unstated was just so different this year. They were like, oh yeah, you know, this year we got that. We couldn't find anything, so we got that from North Dakota. The other year we've gotten it from Georgia. So variety unstated, if it was just a local variety all the time, might be more defensible, but when it's any random stuff we could buy on the national market, it really becomes an indefensible strategy for buying seed. So again, last question is, where is the public sector on this? And I think that is, we haven't been there on cover crop breeding. And I think that's just because we have to go where the funding is. But we now have some funding available at the national level for cover crop breeding and a heck of a lot of enthusiasm. So I hope that we can be there. I hope the public sector can be providing some of that more expensive, basic going after the long shots that are out there, and then getting those seeds to market. Next. Let me drive home the point again. We heard a little bit about crimson clover the other day. Crimson clover, first allowed to be patented under PVP in 1951. Anybody want to guess what the first crimson clover variety released legally was? It was in 1953. Dixie, the market leader right now. Now, we can debate whether it's really Dixie out there right now, but point to me another crop where we, you know, are probably marketing a different variety under a branded name so that we want to make sure we have that Dixie name on our label so that we can sell this seed. When you're wanting to sell a 1953 brand, that's not going to fly with corn too well, is it? And so I think that's another thing that we have to, as we come up with innovations in cover crop, we got to get that out there, and we got to educate. From my side, we spend a lot with our extension agents talking about what's new in cover crop breeding and what we can do. Next. Oh, yeah, sorry, I spoiled my surprise. Another thing that I think there's a lot of misinformation in the cover crop world, And that's just because we haven't had, just the real active education programs on cover cropping, like Julia Gaskin here, one of our speakers runs, is not that old, and there are also a lot of states that don't have them. So I use that as evidence for one of the things that I find inexplicable, this whole market for an early flowering cover crop. Now, there is a niche for early flowering cover crops that, I think some of the organic folks that want to kill a cover crop with just a roller, that makes sense. I can see an early. But for your average grower, why would they plant a legume? They just want to plant a legume to get as much nitrogen as they can out of it. So what drives nitrogen? It's the amount of biomass you have there. It has nothing to do with its flower time, right? If I have, 1,000 pounds of dry matter, do I care whether it's flowering or not flowering? Not much. There's actually a small difference there, but it's the one that's not flowering that would have a little higher percent nitrogen. And so some of these crazes, I've heard this from growers many times. Oh, I want the earlier one because that one will have more nitrogen. I'm like, no, that's not how that works. So we're going to have to get these messages out there. If we're going to get growers down to cultivar specific recommendations, there's also the education behind that is, what is it we're trying to achieve with this cover crop? What is our purpose? That's what drives cultivar, that's what drives species selection as well. Not just general feel good that we want to cover crop, but we actually have agronomic goals with this cover crop. And that lays us into what we want species-wise, that lays us into what we want cover crop-wise. So I think right now we are very far from maximizing, again with these, in many species, very old lines that are being sold, we are very far from maximizing the benefits that growers can receive from cover crops. One of the things that gives me a lot of hope in our own breeding efforts, so I'm an agronomist by training. I have been collaborating with breeders since the very beginning, since my PhD. But actually going out and me running a breeding program and running the selections and everything is not something I contemplated until I got into this cover crop breeding part. Because if you want to improve corn or soybeans and make a line that actually yields better than what Pioneer is putting out, good luck to you, right? I mean, it is a very challenging world to improve upon these crops that have 100 years of incredibly effective breeding. How about these cover crops? We're 2 years in on a couple of species of recurrent selection, and we are soundly beating our checks already. So there is a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit in this area. This is not, I think sometimes when people hear cover crop breeding effort, they think, oh, well, good, I'm looking forward to that in 15 years. Let me know what you got then. That is not the case in cover crops because they've received so little breeding attention. It's very easy to improve upon things that have not been well improved. And again, this is a point, I think, getting down to the specific level at what we're wanting these cover crops to perform makes you realize that what we have bred for in the past is probably not very effective. So breeding a forage has a lot of the same goals that we have for breeding a cover crop. In general, we want a lot of biomass. In general, we want things that are not going to die of a disease in our area, have local adaptation. But there are other things that we want from a cover crop that have no relationship to what a good forage would be. And so being specific about that. A good example might be that our legumes, some of them are decay too fast in our environment, quite a bit too fast. So when we lay out, I can easily get 150 pounds of nitrogen in our environment out of a legume cover crop ahead of corn. It actually decomposes so quickly that it's like not side dressing our crop. I mean, we're putting all of our nutrition out pre-plant. And so we'd actually like to slow that down a bit and we'd make it more resistant to decay. Exactly the opposite of what a forage person is doing, right? A forage person is going for decomposition. They want it to decompose in the gut of the animal very quickly. These are just a couple of slides here as we started out on this work, looking at, we started in peas, and again, we like to look at where a species is relative to the other possibilities out there. And you say, so how many trials have we looked at when we say, well, we're interested in peas for this goal in cover cropping, and one pea got selected to test out in that? Well, we did a little just light screening of possible parents for our breeding population. Which pea you chose was all over the board as to how it performed relative to crimson clover and to hairy vetch. So any of these papers that say, well, pea does this relative to this species, you start to look at with a jaundiced eye there. It's all over the board, as it naturally would be. I think sometimes I draw the parallel. Imagine if the first person stepping foot in Iowa started breaking some of that prairie and said, I've heard about this new crop called corn, and they've got it down in Mexico, and they brought up a Mexican corn line and stuck it in Iowa. You wouldn't have had much corn off of a Mexican corn in Iowa. And they'd been like, well, I guess corn's not the crop for Iowa. That's a lot of times what we are doing when we're doing these species evaluations. When they're taking, forget one, even if they're doing 2 or 3 evaluations, well, that species just is not going to make it here. That is not a sampling of what we could be doing with each of these species in each of these regions. Next. So just some of the things that we look for that we've seen in a couple of these crops. First of all, pea as a fascinating one. I have never seen a crop that is more variable in terms of growth form of things that you can easily access, from the forage types down to the grain types, and you've got the vegetable types. And so we just have massive, there are things that when you first drive up to the field, you're like, what on earth is that? And you get down there and like, well, that's a pea. And the thing beside it's a pea, but they don't look anything alike. Keep going. In our area, because we've never ever actually had pea selection going on before, some of the things that we have just simple freeze tolerance. A lot of lines will just completely drop dead right off the bat. We also have in our area every disease known to man for peas. So I'm trying to learn all my pea diseases, which is no simple task. But we just had one of the experts for the country out and looking at it, and I was like, I just feel like everything in this pea disease booklet I seem to see out here, so I guess I must be doing this wrong. And by the end of the day, it was like, nope, they're all out there. We have every single one of them. So, but the good news is we also have resistance to all of them. So, keep going. We're very focused now on trying to get our system down across all the locations to as high throughput as possible. So this is some near-infrared imaging we do of the pea nurseries, trying to score the disease resistance. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to run through quickly just some of our breeding targets that we're talking about in these species. I'm going to have to step back so I can remember these. Again, rye allelopathy. We're also looking for late local adaptation. Hairy vetch. You'll notice here I like to write local adaptation and everything here because I think that's important. We're going for primarily a late. You'll find we spend majority of our effort on hairy vetch and crimson clover going for late, because I like to say the ideal cover crop for most growers would be one that never bloomed. Now that's going to be hard from a seed production point of view. But again, the point is we would like it to be as late as possible for most growers. There are some folks interested in early for a couple of reasons, like habitat for pollinators and a couple other things. But for the majority, we don't need a bloom. Our Hail Mary or our moonshot for hairy vetch is to eliminate the hard seed coat. So we are spending a lot of resources on trying to make only a soft-seeded vetch. We'll see if that works. It would be unbelievable. Crimson clover, late. We're also trying to get back a hard seed, so it's the opposite. We would like. I think the majority of the market's probably soft seed, but I think there is a market for hard seed. Dixie, when it was first marketed, was marketed as a self-reseeding hard-seeded cultivar. It's not any longer. That's a long story, but. And then peas were primarily after disease resistance and winter hardiness. Okay. But the other part of this is that we have to have a conversation about what the breeding target should be. And we need to be talking to our growers all the time. Again, back to that vineyard, I loved how specific he was with what he wanted out of a cover crop. That's what I can breed around. He's like, well, I need it only this tall, and I need it not to go this way, and I want it to compete. That's the kind of information we have to have if we're going to breed effective cover crops. And so anyway, I look forward to hearing from y'all.